From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be looking at the psychology of Israeli policymaking, and that's right. It's a very unique subject, and we're going to have a very good professor who's going to tell us all about it. Dr. Freilich, professor of political science at Harvard University. He was a former deputy national security advisor and a former senior analyst in the Israeli Ministry of Defense. He wrote a fabulous book called The Zion's Dilemma. It's right here. You definitely want to get it. Excellent book. I highly recommend it. So let's welcome Dr. Freilich to the circle. How are you, sir?
I am well. Thanks for having me.
This is a very intriguing topic. I know we're a psychology show, but I really believe psychology permeates most facets of our life. I'd say about 100%. That covers most. And in this book, when I was reading it, it was really intriguing because there was a lot of psychology involved in decision making. You have to understand the other person. You have to understand yourself and how you're going to respond. Kind of reminded me a little bit about game theory in a sense. A little bit of chess is involved in here. So what motivated you to write this book?
Well, it was really a couple of things. I spent 20-something years in the government in Israel, was deeply involved emotionally in what we were doing, and the book was my way of, on the one hand, trying to make a contribution to help improve things. It was actually, I would say, a work of love and frustration. I mean, love in the sense that I care very much about these issues, and frustration as having been in the government for all those years and saying, we could have done a better job. And why didn't we? Some of it, by the way, had to do with psychology. Some of it had to do with lots of other reasons, harder reasons, I would call them, such as the strategic situation. But those were really the motivations for doing it.
So let's go into the book now. What are some of the problems that you noticed that the state of Israel had when it faced some of these decision-making policies or making policy decisions?
I would say there are two primary factors that affect Israeli national security decision-making. One is the unique political system in Israel. The Israeli system is probably the most democratic system around, in the sense that everyone in Israel is represented. The electoral threshold was just raised in this upcoming election to 3.25%. That's 4 seats in the Knesset. Now, that means if you can get 4 seats, if you can get 3.25% of the public, you're in. Germany, for example, has a 5% threshold. The United States and Britain, which don't have a formal threshold, but they have a real one, a de facto one, which is actually 50%, because they're winner-take-all systems, right? Their constituency, winner-take-all systems. Now, what that means, a victory in the U.S., presidential or otherwise, is usually 52, 53%. That means that 47 or 48% of the people are unrepresented at any given moment. In Israel, that doesn't happen. Everybody has a voice because it's a different system, the low threshold. Israel pays a price for that, though, in terms of governability. The U.S. and Britain, and maybe some people in the U.S. Who are unhappy with what's been happening in the U.S. in recent years, might have a hard time accepting this, but the U.S. enjoys infinitely greater governability at the expense of representation. So Israel pays the governability problem, and it's been a few decades now in which the government has had, I believe, an increasingly difficult time in coping with the various issues, foreign and domestic, that it has to deal with.
It sounds like they have to be very versatile, too. They're going to have to be able to maneuver, but having that kind of diversity and representation might slow them down considerably.
Sure, you have something like 13, 15 parties in the Knesset, and then you have coalition governments of a half a dozen parties. It becomes very, very difficult to govern that way. It's very hard to make decisions because you have to satisfy everybody, and it just doesn't work. So that's one problem. It also leads to a lot of let's say, an undue amount of politicization in the decision-making process. Not that you don't have politics everywhere, of course you do. And they're not necessarily a bad thing. That's how citizens in democracies make decisions, through politics, through the political system.
I have politics with my 4-year-old, yes, I know.
Okay. And sometimes that's really hard.
Yes, indeed.
The political system is one real issue. The other is that Israel lives in a very, very, very tough part of the world, the Mideast. The Mideast changes with breathtaking speed. There are major events here happening all the time. Look what's happened in the last 3 or maybe it's 4 years now, since the outbreak of the so-called Arab Spring. The entire region has been transformed. Syria doesn't really exist as a country anymore. Iraq doesn't really exist as a country. Libya, Yemen hasn't existed as a country for a long time, but even more so. Egypt went through dramatic repeated change. At the moment, it's going through a period of stability. The whole region is changing its face. You have conflicts here throughout the region constantly, and Israel has been embroiled in endless conflicts. So that if you look, take the last decade plus, say take 2000 was a year in which Israel made 3 dramatic peace proposals, 2 with the Palestinians, where it was willing to get out of virtually 100% of the West Bank, 1 with the Syrians, where it was willing to withdraw from 100% of the Golan Heights. That year, you had the outbreak of the Intifada, which was probably the worst terrorist campaign that any country has ever faced. 2003, you had the Second Gulf War, which in the end Israel didn't get involved in, but was afraid that Saddam would fire missiles. 2005 was the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. 2006 was the war in Lebanon. December 2008, January 2009 was the first of 3 rounds with Hamas in Gaza. There was another one in 2012, another one in 2014. Every year or two, you have major historic events taking place that the government has to deal with. It's too much, happening too quickly. It makes decision-making very, very difficult. And it's been this way, actually, ever since Israel was established.
Now, it was established like this in its entire existence for the last 60 years?
Yeah, it's going on 68 years now, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about, I know you wrote a lot in the book about Camp David. I think you wrote about both of them, if I remember correctly.
Right.
And maybe we can even discuss a little bit about those 2 decision-making policy moments, and maybe talk about the future ones that we have now with Gaza, as well as with Iran, maybe as well. So what were the differences between Camp David 1 and 2? What were some of the flaws and maybe some of the distinctions between those 2?
I think it's actually a very interesting comparison. For viewers who don't remember, the first Camp David, 1978, was between Israel and Egypt. President Carter presided. It led to a breakthrough of the Camp David Accords, which then, a year later, were turned into the final peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. The second Camp David in 2000 was Israel, the Palestinians, again presided over by the U.S. by President Clinton, and that one failed. Despite the fact that, as I said before, Israel put forward a dramatic peace proposal in which it was willing to withdraw from virtually 100% of the territory. And the result actually was a couple of months afterwards was the outbreak of the Second Intifada, as I said before, one of the worst campaigns of mass terrorism that any country has ever faced. Now, there's a really interesting difference from a decision-making point of view, and that's what you were asking about. First Camp David, then Prime Minister Menachem Begin, did virtually 0 preparation for the summit. 13 days with President Sadat and President Carter, intensive negotiations. When I tell you he did virtually 0 preparation, I mean virtually 0. There were no meetings of staff. There were no meetings of the cabinet. Nothing.
Why was that? What do you think?
Begin, I think, thought he knew what he wanted and he knew how to get it. And he was a man of vision. He wasn't a man of planning, of detailed policy planning work. And the result, and of course this is my subjective opinion, but I think it was a great one because it led to a peace agreement, which has been in effect for 45 years now and undergone some difficult trials in those years. The Camp David summit in 2000, which was led by, on the Israeli side, by Prime Minister Barak, he did pretty much a textbook perfect planning process. He set up teams to study every possible issue that could come up at the summit, really studied it in detail, formulated careful Israeli negotiating positions, fallback positions, trying to figure out what the Palestinian positions would be, how Israel should handle them. They did it really, as somebody who deals with decision-making, just the way you should have done it. It failed.
Why do you think it failed?
In the sense that Arafat, then the PLO chairman, rejected the offer. Now, of course, you never know in negotiations how the other side is going to respond. But here was simply a case, picture-perfect decision-making process fails. Abysmal decision-making process leads to a historic outcome.
Very fascinating. Two totally different strategies with two totally different results, and really a big impact in history.
Hi, welcome to Delante. This is Delante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Delante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Let me ask you this question. Now we're going to delve a little bit more into the psychological realm for a second. How much do you think plays in this decision-making process the unconscious factors? And I'll try to target that and make it a little more narrow. For instance, Begin or Barak, I mean, was it situations like past resentments towards Egypt, past resentments towards Muslims? Are those factors that start affecting their decisions? By the way, like for instance, thinking of maybe trying to ask for more or give a little less because of the resentments?
I don't think it was a matter of resentment, but I do think that there was a great deal of psychological baggage. Certainly in 1978 with the first Camp David with the Egyptians. You have to remember it was 5 years after the Yom Kippur War, which, other than Israel's War of Independence, was the bloodiest one we ever fought. Israel was caught by a brilliant surprise attack on the part of Egypt and Syria, and was in considerable danger, actually, the first few days of the war. There was fear in Israel of defeat. And so this was just 5 years later. And remember, these are people who are conducting the negotiations, not Begin himself in this case, but some of the other people. For example, Defense Minister Weizmann was a former general. And certainly it's a senior staff people who were working with them and preparing things, as I said, not for the summit, but throughout the negotiating process. The psychological baggage was heavy here. Weizmann, if you can read his autobiography, it's very interesting. He describes it. He says, I spent my whole life looking at Egypt through not a gun rifle, but a gun sight, but he was a pilot, looking through sights. Okay? Egypt for him was a target to be bombed. And now all of a sudden he's meeting with Egyptian counterparts, generals, people who he and his colleagues just a few years earlier had actually been fighting. So there was a lot of psychological baggage here. I had the great fortune at the time, I was a very junior officer, but around the time when, just after the peace treaty was signed, I was on the Joint Military Commission that was set up to coordinate the Israeli withdrawal and the implementation of the peace treaty. And I was there with the first meetings between the two delegations, the Israeli delegation and the Egyptian one. It was mostly colonels and up. As I said, I was the lone junior officer on the Israeli side. And I remember the first meeting, which actually we hosted. And just a small example, we put out some tables full of food to welcome the Egyptian delegation when they arrived. And you saw the Egyptians stood at one table and our guy stood at another table, and there was no communication whatsoever. By the next round or round after, you saw intermingling, and a couple of rounds later, everybody was buddy-buddy. These were guys who had been fighting each other just a few years earlier. So it was, there was a lot to overcome, sure.
That would be a very bizarre experience. That would be really strange to look at that.
It was incredibly rewarding.
Yeah. So let's see. I'm trying to grasp something in my head here. How do we reconcile this then? Because we said we bring in some baggage. I can see the baggage coming in. That's going to be a problem. Begin doesn't prepare, and I'm assuming, and this is, you know what they say about assuming, preparation before a point like this, a deliberation where they're going to go over and make policy decisions. Before you do that, it seems like preparation would help you to mitigate the damage caused by baggage. But it didn't really happen in Camp David #2. How would you overcome the political baggage? Is it preparation or is it something else?
Well, in the second case, I mean, Barak tried to overcome the baggage. He tried to prepare the ground politically. It's interesting, the only exception to what I said before about the textbook perfect preparation of Israeli positions for the summit was one issue, and that was Jerusalem. And it turned out that he was so afraid of the political consequences, not the baggage, but he was so afraid of the impact on the public if it became known that he was preparing, negotiating positions on Jerusalem. If that leaked, and in Israel a great deal leaks, once that got out, he was afraid that the public response would be so strong, the uproar would be so great that he wouldn't have the freedom to negotiate at the summit. And so he instructed his hands would be tied. And so he instructed his team, and I said, they did fabulous work on every other issue. He told them, you may not do any preparation on Jerusalem. I don't want to see the word Jerusalem mentioned on a single document. And so Israel arrives at the summit, as I said, with great files on every one of the issues. There are a half a dozen major issues and hundreds of secondary ones. So everything is prepared except for Jerusalem, because he's afraid of the political consequences there. One of the reasons that Begin probably didn't do the preparation is that he was also afraid of political consequences, particularly within his Likud party, which was and is a right-wing party. And I think one of the ways he got around it was by not bringing anybody into the process and presenting them with a fait accompli at the end. Here, this is it. I've signed a peace agreement. I've signed a peace agreement with Egypt. It now has to be approved by the Knesset, Israel's parliament. Take it or leave it, guys. And people were kind of surprised when he achieved the breakthrough.
It's so complex. I mean, not only do you have the baggage, you have the consequences of what other people are going to think. You have your own livelihood at stake. You have the personalities of differing Middle Eastern countries. I'm assuming Egypt is quite different than dealing with Iran.
Sure,
So,
absolutely.
Very complex stuff.
And you mentioned just, as you were speaking, you mentioned one thing briefly. You said their own political futures being at stake. Well, certainly Begin's political future was at stake, but he brought a success home and was able to ride the success. Barak, when he went to Camp David in 2000, was in a different situation. His coalition was already coming apart when he went to the summit, and he knew that he needed a success in the summit to survive politically. And he went ahead, I think, with incredible courage, put the proposal, the dramatic proposal that he did on the table, knowing that he had lost his coalition at home in the hope of a breakthrough, and he didn't get it. And he continued trying for the next few months, couldn't get the breakthrough because Arafat wasn't willing to negotiate, really, to make any concessions. And in the end, it cost him his political career. It cost him the premiership, at least.
It almost sounds like it was a Hail Mary attempt, almost.
Yeah, it was. It was.
So we understand the complexity. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time. We could have you all day and still try not to figure this all out. That's why I highly recommend you get Zion's Dilemma. But before that, we got a few minutes left. Can you give us a couple of points of how you can improve Israeli policymaking?
Well, Israel has actually made a whole number of institutional changes in recent years. And the biggest one was the passage of a law in 2008, making the National Security Council now a legal institution, a binding institution. It had already existed since 1999. Those were actually the years where I was there, but we didn't know every day when I came to work if the place was still going to be there the next day, because it was a temporary situation. And then the law was passed in 2008. I think that was a major step, which will have a slow, gradual, long-term impact, but I hope it will have one over the years. And that comes on top of a whole bunch of other institutional reforms, so that I think in terms of the decision-making structure, we're in good shape today. The place where there is need for a real change, I think, is in the political system, the electoral system. I mentioned before, we get good marks for representation, but not for governability. And so a reform has to be made, and it can be done in a variety of ways, but the reform has to ensure that a prime minister can govern for 4 years, except in really exceptional circumstances. And what we've had for the last few decades is that almost no prime minister can actually serve for more than 2 to 3 years. The current elections are being held after 2 years. The one before that was the only government since the 1950s that actually lived out just about its full 4-year term. Every other government for the last few decades has done at most 2 to 3 years. And that you can't govern that way. That means you're in a perpetual state of elections. People's time horizons, their planning horizons, are months or a year or something. An American president has 4 years to govern. So we have to ensure that we have to deal with the fragmentation in the Knesset, too many parties. We need some more centralized control.
In the last couple of minutes here, does America influence the Israeli policymaking?
I think there's a misconception among a lot of people in the U.S. that Israel goes its own way often or too often. And even though being a very, very, very close ally of the United States and being overwhelmingly dependent on the United States, at the same time still seems to go its own way, occasionally even thumb its nose. I don't think people understand that probably the primary consideration in every Israeli strategy session, whether it's among the senior officials or in the cabinet, the number one consideration that's taken into account is what's the U.S. position. Now, Israel it's not 100% conformity with what the United States would want. On most issues it is. The determining factor is really what's the American preference here. And there are a few exceptions, 1 or 2 major ones. The settlements issue, of course, stands out as being the number one exception. But with those couple of exceptions, really, Israel tries to its utmost, to its very best, to conform to what the U.S. Policy in the region is.
That's fascinating.
I was even surprised when I was in meetings in the National Security Council that the first consideration people would raise is, well, what's the U.S. policy? And I would say sometimes, we're the Israeli government, we're the Israeli National Security Council. Let's figure out what the Israeli interest and policy should be first Then we'll take into account the American one and we'll work it in. And of course, it's going to be one of the primary considerations. But first, let's figure out the Israeli preference here. People say, no, they're going to just go to what the U.S. wants.
Really? That's going to really complicate matters as well. Oh, jeez. Too much, not enough time. Thank you so much, Dr. Freilich, for being on the show. We truly appreciate it. Once again, the book, The Zion's Dilemma, Dr. Freilich, Professor of Political Science at Harvard University. We thank you as well for joining us. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, even in the Knesset, we're there. See you next time, everyone. And also catch our web TV show, Circle of Insight, on therapycable.com.